Hi, my name is Stephen Brand. I'm the Executive Director of Global Learning and Development at Bay Path University in the Strategic Alliances Division. We run a variety of learning experiences for corporations, nonprofits, and organizations and governments. And today's session, really intrigued by today's session, we have some great presenters talking about incivility in the workplace. This is a really important issue. We've seen recently issues of incivility in the airline industry, and so we're going to address that as we go through. Not the airline industry. We're going to address that on how you come into a situation and how to deal with it wherever you are in the organization. So we're going to start from the audience. I want to welcome everybody who's attending, and we want to get everybody started participating. So if you look on the right side of your screen, there's a box that says questions. And so I'm going to ask a question, and I'd like you to throw in an answer here. And the question is, what word characterizes how you might feel or how you do feel when you encounter someone who has some level of incivility in your work, or with customers or with employees? So with the employees. So write something in there so we can get the audience involved pretty quickly. Maybe share with us some thoughts. Oh, disappointed, we've got somebody. Fear, it's always a good one. Discomfort. Thank you, Darcy. Got some more? I'm sure we got some people who have come across people with incivility. And if you haven't come across someone, if you did, how would you deal with it? What would you feel? Nervous? From Joan, it's got some good ideas there. Nervous. Annoyed. Any of our panelists, give me a word from your standpoint. How do you feel when you come across something like that? Just one word.
Actually, inquisitive.
Inquisitive. Ah, curious. Uncomfortable, someone says. Suzanne said uncomfortable. Sandy, you got a word?
I would say on point.
On point. Okay.
Mm-hmm. It's showtime.
Yeah. Jesse, you have a thought?
Yeah, I would say opportunity.
Opportunity. So clearly someone whose job it is to confront these things, it's more of a challenge and an opportunity to explore and ask questions. I find for me it's curious. I'm curious because I don't want to be defensive, I don't want to be emotional, I just really want to understand, because many times in this situation, you folks know probably more than me, is sometimes we react instead of understand, and we don't want to act that way. So thank you very much, everyone. Just been, we have a few more that come in here. Lori said paused. Someone said on edge. And so what I'd like to do is have the panelists introduce themselves, the name, their company, or what they're doing now. But more importantly, how does this concept and this topic resonate with the kind of work that you do, and what sort of resonates with you? Let's start with Jesse, please. Jesse?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I'm Jesse Stanley. I'm currently with Strongside Principles, a firm that I founded about 7 years ago. I come from the asset protection loss prevention industry. And when it comes to disruptive or uncivil behaviors, I work with clients a lot on this topic, and a few things really come to mind, and this resonates with me for a few different reasons, but one of the things that comes to mind, as I said, is opportunity. These are challenges, and Stephen, as you mentioned, when you work with challenging people for a profession, your paradigm begins to shift, but that's not to say that everybody's paradigm can't shift. Right? So even though I see it as a challenge and then ultimately as an opportunity, there are other feelings that happen, anxiety, fear, lots of things go on when you're dealing with this stuff, but I love this topic because it is universal. I don't care where you are, if you're working with people, you're dealing with challenging behaviors. And so because it's universal, because we're all going to deal with it, it's a skill that we should be developing, and we don't see that a whole lot. We don't see a lot of folks really doing a lot of work to get better at this. In fact, what they try to do is avoid it. People say that the fears, the number one fear out there, I believe, is public speaking. There are other fears like divorce and moving, etc. But actually, the number one fear, according to the research I've read, is actually conflict with another human being. when it's asked the right way. And so what we want to do is we, of course, want to address those fears and then shift that paradigm so that we actually can begin to win at this challenge and then begin to see the opportunity that is within uncivil behaviors.
Yeah, this win piece is something that, Jesse, you and I have talked about a fair amount, which is how do you turn conflict and disruptive behavior into a win? I don't want you to address it now, but we'll get to that in a minute. JP, you want to address this, get started in the conversation?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. My name is JP Perry, and I'm with Edward Jones. I've been a financial advisor with them for 12 years. I actually work in a unique role as being able to walk my clients through a tailored solution for them and making sure that they get to their financial goals. But I'm also a trainer with Edward Jones, and I train diverse and non-diverse financial advisors that are new to the industry for the state of Florida. So from an uncivil point, I can see it from two ways: as being a client dealing with me, having emotions, being able to talk them through the issues. And so the word that I used was inquisitive, because I want to know the why behind someone feels the way they do when they become disruptive or maybe angry or upset, because the why is going to help me figure out a way that is a win for both them and myself, and maintain a situation where it's calm and cool and collective. From dealing with financial advisors, especially my ones who are diverse, there's not many diverse people in this industry, and so those financial advisors that are new might have expressed to them some uncivil rest. And so being able to help them understand the why, gauge their emotions, and walk them through a situation where there's a win for both the person that they're coming across and for themselves.
Thank you very much, JP. By the way, I think of incivility in your industry as when my financial advisor tells me that money has dropped significantly and I want to blame them instead of the economy, but that's a whole other conversation we could have later. I do want to encourage the audience to start asking questions. This whole design of this kind of a webinar is really totally around what the interest of the audience is all about, and so please start asking questions, and I will address as many of them as I possibly can as we get to the next level. I have a few questions, but I'm really hoping that all of you will start throwing the questions at us. Thank you very much. Okay, Sandy from Bloomingdale, why don't you give us a little bit of a sense of what your thought about this topic is?
All right, thanks. Again, my name is Sandy Chandler. I'm the Director of Asset Protection for the Los Angeles market. I have about 25 years of experience in the asset protection industry. And when I think of dealing with uncivil behavior, a lot of the time I think of what my core values are. And number one, most important, is the customer experience, making sure that we exceed the customer's expectations at all costs. Safety is top of mind always with our associates and our customers, and preparation is crucial to success. In addition to that, we have to protect our brand at all times. I'm sure some of you have heard about the United scandal and what took place recently, and then also think of Chipotle maybe with food safety and the impact it had on their profitability as a company. So when I think of those things, the customer experience, safety, and protecting the brand, I think of when there is uncivil behavior, what is the cost of that to us as a business? And there's decreased work effort when there's uncivil behavior. There is lost work time. There's turnover. There's a decline in the quality of work performance. It can turn away customers. The store team could deteriorate with morale. And also managing incidents is quite expensive when an incident happens in your business. So when I think of uncivil behavior, I look at proactive strategies. If you think of a cycle of dealing with uncivil behavior, then I think of the incident itself, and then I think of the reactive strategies that we can use as best practices. As an example, we need to educate folks proactively on what the cost is of uncivil behavior. We have to create workplace standards that value civility. We have to provide internal training and coaching. We have to encourage open communication and feedback, communicate early and often. And then also, we have to, prior to incidents, establish quality partnerships with first responders, because that's crucial when an incident happens. Again, emotions are high, tensions are high when you're dealing with an uncivil incident. During the incident, you have to have a high level of communication, anticipate the needs of the customer, but oftentimes think of listening to the customer because their needs are sometimes different than what we anticipate their needs are. So active listening is crucial. And when you're approaching somebody, prior to the approach, take a deep breath, relax a little bit. That settles your mind. Be very aware of your body language and always think in your mind, what can I do to help this customer? And then react accordingly.
Keep going. Keep going.
I usually use a 4-step process when addressing customers. It's offering to help, introducing myself, and then let's say, as an example, they're doing some type of uncivil behavior. I'm going to ask them to stop doing whatever uncivil behavior that is because it can offend customers and I wouldn't be able to help them. Then I'll go to a 3rd step if they continue to do the uncivil behavior, let's say profanity, and I would tell them what the consequences are. I won't be able to help you, and then I'll have to ask you to leave. Then I go to step 4. Now, there's a fine line between risk and also addressing uncivil behavior. If there's ever a direct threat towards one of my associates or another customer, you immediately pick up the phone and call 911.
I do want to make a couple of quick comments here. By the way, we're getting some great questions, which I will refer to. I urge everyone to write short questions because I'm reading and paying attention and following at the same time. So please do that. I will say I want to refer to a comment that was made by Cindy. Not sure where she works, but she said that they have a policy here called check, challenge, and chill, which is an interesting way of looking at it. I'm not sure the order of that. I mean, maybe Sandy, you referred to it maybe check, chill, and then challenge. I don't know, but I think that's kind of interesting, and I think Sandy gave some recommendations. Cindy also asked if you have any recommendations for other type of solution that would be more effective than those 3 in a row. Is there any kind of like guidelines that your companies use that sort of stand out for things you need to do immediately when you hit some situation like this?
Well, besides check, challenge, and chill, really with me it's safety, care, and presentation. It's all about the presentation to the customer. It's ensuring the safety of everyone around you and your surroundings, and really taking genuine care in addressing that customer's needs.
Thank you. I will, although Jesse didn't say this in his introduction, his former employer was the Walt Disney World, and he was head of asset management there. And I want to ask a question about branding and how does dealing with incivility support or not support the brand? Is this issue different in a company like, in a local amusement park versus Disney? So how do you protect your brand while confronting people who have some level of incivility? Jesse, you want to deal with that, especially from the Disney-ish standpoint?
Yeah, I'd love to. You may need to cut me off, Stephen, because this is a passion topic for me. So when I've hit my expiration date, just give me the sign. So first of all, this is how you deal with challenging behavior or uncivil behavior has a huge impact on your brand, right? And it actually starts with you've got to understand what your brand is, what your company DNA is, and the way that you instruct your people to deal with these challenges needs to actually match that DNA. So if you are somebody who touts customer service, Bloomingdale's, where Sandy is, for example, where they are all about customer service, they are a high-end retailer. If that's what your brand is, but you come at them with a nightclub mentality when it comes to challenging behaviors, which unfortunately out there in the world happens a lot, you see where there's friction between your brand and how you're actually dealing with very common behaviors. So this is key. At Disney, we did a number of things that really tried to support our brand and really actually, sometimes it was hard as an asset protection professional because you felt, excuse the pun, but you felt handcuffed to deal with things the way you thought you should deal with them because brand was so important. So making sure that your approach is appropriate, making sure that even when somebody's really behaving poorly, you think in terms of invitations, as you would in a hospitality company, right? You invite people in, you don't demand people in. So we would think in terms of invitations when we needed to talk to them. We were very keen on making sure that we introduced ourselves, and that's just a good thing to do in general. Making sure that you introduce yourself for a number of reasons. Another example of clients that I have are church clients, and again, their DNA, especially if it's say a biblical-oriented church, like a New Testament church, where they are professing Christians, they are supposed to be kind and respectful, and it's supposed to support the Gospels. And so I work with those folks on making sure that their security assets actually match their DNA, because again, kind of like a high-end service place, it'd be a little awkward to be at a church and have the bar bouncer come to ask you to settle down.
You know, it actually reminds me of the brand question of Ed DeBevick's in Chicago, where the waitresses are there to yell at you for not eating your vegetables. So that's where the incivility is actually part of the theme, right? So there's a lot of theme. You go to a theme park, there's a lot of incivility that's just part of the theater. And I just think that's sort of an interesting, that's sort of an offshoot of the conversation. But again, in theme parks, is this real or not? Is it, thematic, or is it just really incivility? Hey, JP, what are your thoughts about this branding issue with your company as it may reflect with other financial services companies in terms of how your company deals with it?
Thanks, Stephen. It's a huge deal. So our tagline internally is whatever's best for the client. And so it flows through the DNA of our firm as far as our compliance department. When we deal with clients, when clients get surveys, it all centers around making sure whatever we did for them was best and making sure that they understood that. And so when we're dealing with them, that's one of the questions that I'm always looking for. Maybe I don't ask it directly, but making sure that they understand what's going on and knowing their options and knowing what's best for them. Even from the financial advisor training role, you have different people that come from different walks of life, and maybe they got hired, but maybe they have ulterior motives. And it's just a retraining so that they understand our brand. And if they're going to have an office down the street from me as a fellow advisor, I want to make sure that they're doing what's best for their clients, because whatever they do will affect me. Because that name, the Edward Jones logo, and the name carries weight, right? So it's almost like, my dad, when I was little, told me, son, if you ever got in trouble at school, they're going to look at your last name and they're going to call me, right? And so we care for each other. We want to protect our clients from making, financial decisions that could be costly, but we also want to make sure that we protect one another from making costly mistakes, because it's all about the brand.
Yeah. I think it's also very interesting, and I think they do this at Disney, where you train your vendors too. So if someone's driving a bus to your location, the bus driver, even though they may not work for your company, is representing the brand, because the customer doesn't distinguish between the vendor and you and your partner. So that's an interesting thing to be thinking about.
Yeah, that's actually a great example, Stephen, because that's the second part, right? You set up your policies, make sure that your policies and procedures actually support the brand you're trying to build and protect, and then you make sure that anybody who represents that brand actually is trained the way you want them to behave, right? So whether they work for you directly or whether they are a third party. It's a great point.
Deborah's got a really, what's that, Sandy?
I agree. I think with you as leaders, we have to make sure that we're managing ourselves and also setting the tone for the organization. Everybody from the top down, cascading, sets the tone, and we have to model good behavior. And that's going to be returned tenfold when we continue to follow that practice. And ask for feedback again. Pay attention to progress with your training. And avoid water cooler talk, right? That's very detrimental to businesses. As you can see, I have a water cooler in my office, so it's pertinent. But again, follow your company protocol for communication standards, and make sure that media relations is in the loop if you think it's a significant incident as well.
Well, thank you very much. Deborah asked a really interesting question, and me coming from New York, I kind of can relate to this. Oftentimes I'm being told that I'm too aggressive in the way that I ask questions of people when I'm trying to understand what that person is thinking. How do you get to the bottom line without asking questions that feel people think that you're being aggressive or judgmental. So how do you pose? I mean, it's easier when you're from California, I guess. But I know people that like, well, you're being judgmental, but actually it's very different. The cultures are very different in these different parts of the country. So any thoughts about that? How do you ask questions without people becoming defensive that you're questioning them in a certain way, especially if you're just curious and like a detective?
Yeah, I think if you're offering service, if you're genuinely interested in what their concerns are and telling them you are going to help them, and be very low-key. Again, don't raise your voice above what their level or tone is. And again, use open body language, smile. Oftentimes we forget to smile when we're interacting with folks and it's a stressful situation, right? So we want to ask open-ended questions, not just yes or no, but how can I give you a better experience? What can I help you with? How can we resolve this? Really think of open-ended questions to really let them do most of the talking, because if they're doing most of the talking, they're venting, you're de-escalating the situation. You can do a test with if you have another partner and have one person say expletives, the other person continuously say, I'm sorry you feel that way, what can I do to help you? And you'll see that person de-escalate over time. So again, really having that customer service mindset is crucial.
Yep. Jesse, you want to say something?
Yeah, I'll just add to what Sandy said. I think open-ended questions are great. Actually, that is a great way to express empathy, and I want to kind of get to the crux of the question. So people come to, they basically have their own bias. So if I'm from California, and when I first started dealing with New Yorkers, it was a bit of a culture shock, right? People are a bit more direct. They come off a bit more abrasive in some situations, but the key word that I just said there is that was my bias. So the behavioral observations may be right on. They do tend to be more direct. But one thing that can cut through that bias is, it's one of the principles that we rest on, is that people are much more likely to work with you, and they're much less likely to attack you if they see you as an ally and not an enemy. And when you follow that principle through, that will cut through even biases. So now I actually have spent so much time in New York working with people in New York. I see through that bias, and I actually kind of take it on because I actually have learned to really appreciate it. But I think that's a very, very wise question. How do you get through what people would see as their bias towards you? Open-ended questions. Really presenting yourself as an ally, and in fact, even addressing it. If you know that you're dealing with somebody who is not from the Northeast, say, I'm in Florida, say they're from the South, you just address it head on. Hey, I want to help you here, and obviously, I come from a different area where we talk a little bit differently, but what's important to me is that you understand I'm here to help you. That little preface will go a long way as then you begin to deal with folks.
Yeah, I think that my biggest trigger when I deal with organizations is, oh, that's our policy. It just drives me crazy. Instead of trying to empathize with me and understand the situation that I'm going through. And you brought up empathy. We do a lot at Bay Path University in empathy. We really feel that this is a way to become much better in business if you're trying to not just feel bad for people, but actually try to understand where they're coming from. And so we really talk a lot about that. And we did a whole conference on it a couple weeks ago. And so I think that trying to understand it from their standpoint instead of saying, well, I don't understand why you feel that way, I think is really, really important. I do want to ask a question that Betsy asked, which is really, she used the word tenured. I probably, because she's academia, I don't really know, but what about colleagues who are chronically uncivil and tenured, and people have been maybe talking with them about it? How do you work with people who are there and there's no way to get rid of them and they are just totally uncivil to the people they interact with, both colleagues, I guess people they report to, and also the community that you're serving? Any thoughts about how you deal with that when you have no control over whether they're there or not? How can you help them?
I'll take.
Okay.
You can oftentimes, we come across what I call toxic people a lot of the time, where they may be constantly negative. They might even say demeaning comments, unpositive comments, And again, it really comes back to modeling the good behavior, setting the tone, and making sure that you don't let those comments that people are saying get you down. You have to almost envision yourself as having a Teflon non-stick suit on. And whatever somebody says to you when they're angry, they're not mad at you specifically, they're mad at what you represent. So when dealing with toxic people, I oftentimes will find out again what their needs are, find out why they're feeling that way, and if they don't want to open up to me, it may be a situation where you need to get out of that situation and head out and maybe not spend as much time with that person if they always have the same personality. I try and surround myself with great people, right? But you do have people in the workplace that you have to deal with, and you have to really find out what are the keys for their success and to be able to help them become successful and what they strive for. What are their values? Again, asking a lot more open-ended questions, and sometimes it's simply asking them to go for coffee and find out, what's important to them. And then you can get to the root cause and then help them with them being successful, and that in turn will ease the situation.
Yeah, the coffee situation is interesting because I think, as a wise aunt of mine once said, which is anger is the result of unmet expectations. And sometimes we see this frustration and anger and we make assumptions about why they're angry. When in reality, if you just try to peel, the onion and you go inside, you can really understand that there's something else going on. And if you're curious, then maybe you could pull that out and you could be more empathetic and help them more. JP, do you see any difference with the way the people you develop, the ones who are a little bit more brusque than others in their success in business, those who are more uncivil in dealing with clients? You find a difference?
Yeah, it's weird. I was part of a study when a young woman was getting her doctorate about 4 years ago, and it was on emotional intelligence. And at the end of the study, she gave me the results, and what she discovered was 75% of the self-talk, the stuff that we tell ourselves internally, is negative. And that feeds off of, over and over again. And then sometimes we have the ability to put that onto the person that's in front of us. And so that's typically where I'll start a conversation with someone I'm training, is just tell me how you're feeling. Tell me what's going through your head. Tell me why you feel that way and what's making you feel that way, so that we can make the situation better for you and for the clients that you face every day. But yeah, that's a good point. And I know Jesse probably has come across the same thing in the various channels that he's been a part of.
Yeah. Actually, I want to add to what's been said here. One of the things that for the person who asked the question, I would just, I'm sure you know this, but I would just say, don't try to change anyone, right? And that's something where a lot of people really drive themselves crazy, is that they don't like the behaviors they're seeing, and they're interested in changing the person versus impacting the behavior. So even in customer service-oriented issues, but especially long-term work employee issues, I don't have a desire to try to change anyone. What I do have a desire to do is impact behaviors, and that all depends on context. There are people that I've worked with that were very, very difficult to work with, and the reality is, and it's been said here already, sometimes you just suffer through it. You keep your distance. You try not to add into their aggression cup in any way, and it just is what it is. But other times the context is that you do need to impact those behaviors and significantly. I'll tell you a quick story. I should keep names and et cetera out of this. So I was with a very large hospitality and theme park provider, and we had a gentleman who owned basically the equivalent of timeshare on property. And for a couple of years, he had been coming to the property with his wife, and they're very, very difficult to deal with. They would make cast members, associates cry. They would just frustrate the general managers to no end. And this pot had been boiling for some time, and it began to boil over about 3 months before I got involved, to the point where associates were employees were saying that they were afraid to actually engage with this person because of his belligerent outbursts. His wife would be there with him, and oftentimes the spouse or somebody who's with a belligerent person will actually be a calming force. His wife would embolden him and hop into the fray with him, and it was really become a difficult situation to the point that it was at the president's level, and some of his assistants were dealing with this, and they were prepared to revoke his ownership, basically refund his money and say, you're never invited back here again. You know, we're sure you can find someplace else to enjoy your vacations. And they asked me to get on a call with them. And sure, you know, to form exactly as they had described, he just immediately got belligerent, was very insulting, not quite threatening, but you felt threatened. He would cut you off in a moment and just wanted absolute control. That is a difficult and challenging person to work with. And what's interesting is that I had gotten enough information about him, and I'd kind of worked up a bit of a behavioral profile on him and realized that what we were dealing with was a simple bully. And he was in a place where customer service was king, and he knew he'd be treated well no matter how he acted, and therefore the worse he acted, the better he got treated because they wanted to move him along. And so you know, I don't know if this sounds funny, but basically at one point I was interjecting into this conference call conversation, and he began to interrupt me, and I didn't let him interrupt me. I continued to talk, and he continued to try to interrupt me. For about 5 minutes, we both talked, and I will tell you that was difficult. I didn't have 5 minutes of things to say, so I just kept making things up, and the reason was I knew that as soon as I gave in his mind, he was winning, and it would empower him. About 5 minutes into this back and forth, or actually it wasn't back and forth, it was parallel tracks, he finally got really frustrated and said, what? Why aren't you listening to me? And I just explained, oh, sir, I've been talking. I'm not sure if you heard me. Do you need me to repeat it? And he said yes, and so it took me about 10 seconds to repeat it. And it's very interesting. I didn't solve the issue, but he was introduced to a new alpha dog. Somebody who wasn't going to be mean, I wasn't going to be disrespectful, I wasn't going to add to his aggression cup, but I also wasn't going to back down. So in that circumstance, it worked out great. But as soon as I tell that story, I always go back to, you only use that tactic or that strategy when you need to. Sometimes folks, you just suffer through them, and they just are what they are, and it's kind of sad actually for them. They tend to make themselves pretty lonely.
Yeah, I had a situation where I had an employee who was really angry and frustrated and a little uncivil, and I basically turned to him and said, you know, you don't seem to like to come to work. Don't you want to get a job that, and so instead of getting like the tenure piece, don't you want to go find a place where you can be happy to show up every day? And they're like, oh, I just want to fight. And so at some point you need to sort of take down the barrier and say, how can you make your life happier and nicer? No one deserves that life. There's another question from Cheryl. How do you handle staff behavior when it's not done in front of you and you hear that it's happening at the water cooler, somewhere else, in someone else's office? What's the best way to confront, employee incivility when it's being done behind your back, when it's directed at you? Any thoughts about that?
I'll take this one. Again, a lot of training and awareness up front on what the expectations are with civility. Hopefully your company has some type of policy on civility, and you do a lot of training and awareness on that, on what your core values are and what your standards are. The key thing is to not participate in it and to model that behavior. And if you're modeling that behavior, then others are going to look up to you if you're a leader and follow suit.
Actually, we have an interesting, Deborah, to the comments before, said, I have to agree to disagree. Deborah, feel free to chime in with what you disagree and what you recommend that other people may not have gotten to. I will, either one of you, I think Jesse, you gave us one example, but to the other two, do you have any situations and environments where you come across a customer and it's just totally very difficult to deal with? And can you tell us what you experienced and then how you handled it?
Yeah, so I've had tons of clients from the northeastern part of the United States, and last year I had a particular client who had been with me for about 5 years, and to the T, what Jesse described is sometimes if you're not used to that way of doing business, then that might be sort of difficult to deal with at first. But we had gotten to know each other over the 4 or 5 year period, but it was still pretty insistent, and he would come in and he wanted to be the alpha dog and wanted things his way. And so finally I just asked him, how many advisors have you had in the last 10 years? And he said 6. And I was bold enough to say, well, you know, it's probably not me at this point in time because I've done everything that I can do for you. And so it was a rather large account, but he transferred out the next day, and it was probably best. He got what he wanted probably from someone else, but it wasn't going to happen for me, and I was happy to come to work again. And so sometimes you just have to part ways, especially in my line of work, and that's okay.
Hey, JP, I just want to echo, I think that's a great example, and it relates to something that you said, Stephen. What you both did is that you basically reflected behaviors back to the person, right? And it's so interesting. In your case, JP, you reflected those behaviors and that reality back to him, and you parted ways, and you did it respectfully. So again, you didn't add to his aggression cup. And Stephen, in your case, when you reflected, you actually opened his eyes. Because you know, one thing that's really important to remember when it comes to these type of behaviors is that this is not an us-them situation. It's not that there are these people out there who are uncivil, disruptive, challenging. We all step onto that spectrum at times. We all step onto that pathway at times, and sometimes it's something as simple as somebody reflecting back what we're saying, and it opens our eyes to something we were blind to. It's the same with gossip. You know, Sandy's answer on gossip was great. I would just add on gossip that you have two parties in gossip, right? The person who actually said the gossip, and then the person who's spreading the gossip and telling you about it. And sometimes people don't think about it as gossip. They don't think about it as uncivil behavior. They think it's just banter and talk. And oftentimes that simple reflection of saying, hey, you know, I'm hearing that you're saying these things, and I'm not sure of what your intention is, but I can tell you how it's being perceived. With many people, that's enough to just set them straight. Not everyone, you know.
By the way, the end of the story was that individual sent me a box of cookies after she quit, thinking, you saved me, because I was miserable and I didn't realize that I had an option that I should just leave and find something else. And that's what happened. Actually, it was a really good answer, because I saved her from disaster, which was, you know, and stress. The gossiping question is really good. Joan says that gossiping at the water cooler could now be construed as bullying, and that the person, I would point out to the person and tell them to be careful, because it could affect their job. So it's interesting. Just talking behind people's back actually connote a sense of bullying. And how does that work? I mean, any thoughts about that? And is it? I mean, it's incivility, but it may not be anger. It may just be, I'm frustrated. You know, how do you guide someone if you're actually at the water cooler or somewhere where they're talking negatively about someone, and moving from, I'm frustrated, what can I do, to that person is awful and I don't want to work with them and they're awful for these reasons? Any thoughts about that?
I think a lot of companies have associate surveys where you can do completely anonymous surveys on how they feel their supervisor is supporting them in the role, because really when you're in leadership, it's all about support. And you really need to find out and get to the root cause as to why there may be some opportunities with morale, either within your department, within your company. And really that comes down to the human resources department and discussing with leadership what we can do better to empower our associates to make the right decisions, and to find out why they're frustrated, because it could be a multitude of issues, but unless you ask those questions, you're not going to know. So anonymous surveys are really good tools to help find out what you need to focus on better as an organization. And then also just simple touch bases on a regular basis with everybody you interact with to find out how they're doing personally.
Nicole's got a point here about how to turn gossip into positive. She didn't say it this way, but I'm going to say it is how do you be positive in confronting people? How do you have a protocol for confronting people who you disagree with, or feel frustrated about. So I think it's a point that really has got to be brought up. How do you feel comfortable with that confrontation and not have them then become defensive, and then you've got this constant back and forth on it?
I mean, I'll offer, I'm not sure, unless you do it a lot, I'm not sure you'll ever get comfortable because it is potential conflict. But oftentimes those open-ended questions, so think of it this way, I want to show somebody that they're gossiping and I want to impact their behaviors. We've talked a lot about this already. I'm going to ask those open-ended questions, and I'll tell you one that I ask my children. And if you have children, you can learn a lot about disruptive behavior and how to deal with it. When I have 4 boys, so there's lots of testosterone in the house, and they're just 3 of them are teenagers, and they'll come home and they'll talk about somebody on the football team or somebody in the neighborhood. And of course, some of that's venting, and you want those conversations. Those are great learning opportunities. But when it feels like it's going over towards gossip, which basically means that you're actually trying to do damage to that person, you're trying to damage their reputation, typically with gossip, then it's a very simple question. Would you say this to their face? And if my boys say no, I don't say, well, then you shouldn't say it here. I follow up with, then why are you telling me now? Why would you tell me and not tell them? And it's interesting. Sometimes they come back around, and the message they were trying to deliver isn't bad. They were really venting and processing, and they're processing out loud, but their tactics were very poor. And they won't ever answer that way, but in their answer you'll see that. So those type of questions, would you say this to their face? Would you want this to be known? Would you put this on Facebook? Those are really valuable questions that, again, for many people can deter them from gossip. And some folks really don't care, and some folks really just can't see it. And in that case, you're looking at a decision. Do you feel that you need to report it to somebody? Do you feel that you need to tell them that, listen, I don't want to hear this? That is a very good tactic, by the way, just saying, hey, I understand. I'm not going to judge you for what you're saying, but I will tell you, this is just conversation I don't want to hear.
I want to go back into the customer realm. You talked about Facebook, there's Yelp, there's all sorts of things that customers can do if they're unhappy. And I guess the point is, and a lot of the people online here are frontline employees. We have some managers around, but some frontline folks. So what's the role of the person who's not confronting? Like, what's the role of the customer? We talk about, those people taking pictures of the United Airlines situation. What's the role of the customer? What's the role of the employee that's not directly in the confrontation? So what were the players in a confrontational situation, and how do they play a role that's not just let's just sit back and wait until they figure this out, the security guard's there, like, how do we handle this? What's the role of everybody, all the players in the theater of a conflict? Any thoughts?
Well, I can speak to that. Initially, it's communication, and again, preparation. At what point do we need to call other outside support in to address the situation? All of our folks are trained that if there is a social media situation, so let's say, for example, there's an incident in a store where maybe one customer is in an altercation with another customer. Again, we don't know what caused that or what initiated that. However, we can be a presence there, ask what we can do to help. You would never want to step in for safety reasons and break those 2 folks up or those individuals up, just as a comment there. But our folks are trained where if we have other customers that are filming in the store and you have the luxury of training your folks ahead of time, maybe they step in front of those folks, not necessarily telling them not to record, but also just asking for safety reasons that maybe they move to another area of the store so they don't get hurt. And that helps to de-escalate the situation as well as keep it safe for all customers and associates.
By the way, before we continue on this, before Jesse, I just want to let everybody know we still have room for a few more questions. So if you want to, just throw them in there. I try to address as many as possible, but we still have a few more questions we could take. Jesse, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think, Sandy, you hit some great points there, and just to highlight one of them, just make sure you always assume that you are potentially going to be on social media, right? And it's actually a great self-behavior check. Think about it. If somebody was filming this and I saw it on YouTube, would I send that link to my mother? And that tends to curtail a little bit about a little bit of what you would do and what you might say. And when we think specifically of roles, there are several roles going on here. You've got the actual person being uncivil. You have the bystanders, which actually are very interesting and really, depending on the situation, sometimes really should be paid a lot of attention to, because bystanders can go either way, right? Several different ways. They can be very passive. They can actually get tired of the uncivil person and become uncivil themselves, which happens often and becomes a very big issue, or they can actually come to the uncivil person's aid. And so how you deal with those bystanders is very, very important. And Sandy, you hit on something, the idea of trying to shut down cameras. That idea probably died in the 90s because there are so many cameras. You get put on camera trying to shut down a camera. If you have a policy that there's no filming, of course you need to try to enforce that policy appropriately. But for the most part, you're probably not going to shut down the cameras, and you probably don't want to be the person seen as the one who's shutting down what people would consider free speech. You also have a role, and I think this relates to United, Stephen, you brought that up. You also have the role of law enforcement. And this is where you have to be very, very careful. So if I can, do you mind if I just kind of make a note on United, the United Airlines situation?
Go for it.
So I do not want to get into whether or not their policies are good or bad. I'm as a professional, as a passenger, I've not always liked the way I was treated by airlines, but as a professional, I don't know what they have to deal with. But I will tell you this: when you look at that situation, one of the decisions that they made is very common, and what they did is they had a policy issue, right? That you could infer in some way that the guy is breaking the law, that the passenger was breaking the law because he is being asked to leave and he wouldn't leave. Now, that is fraught with legal issues, and attorneys will sort that out. But here's what they did. They actually called in law enforcement. And I'm a huge supporter of law enforcement, but let's be very clear. When law enforcement gets involved, they have a different paradigm. They have different responsibilities, and they have different ways of doing things. And what happens when law enforcement gets involved is when law enforcement says, sir, we need you to get up and leave, and that customer fails to obey, you now have actually a violation of law. You have now escalated the situation, and law enforcement in most areas are not trained to say, hey, we tried. We tried, we can't get them to go. They will use force in order to get compliance. And just by calling law enforcement there, they open themselves up to this happening. In fact, I would say that if you're going to call law enforcement, just think about it this way. If it's a safety issue, of course, you should call law enforcement. But if it's not a safety issue, think about it this way. If something goes wrong and there's a use of force, do you want to be in the papers tomorrow saying that, a passenger wouldn't give up his seat and was beat up by United Airlines representatives? And if that's not the case, then maybe you should actually use some other tactics that I'm not sure they used. For instance, making sure that you switch players. One flight attendant tries to get the customer to comply, then that's not working, so you get a second flight attendant who would come and try to be that person. And then you would go to the flight lead. You could even go to the co-captain. And you could then go to the captain, which is, from what I understand, actually required by law before you call law enforcement. So now you have escalation. You can also use escalation techniques like make sure you ask, then you tell them what's going to happen if they don't listen. Then you do everything you can to confirm that they don't want to listen, that they don't want to follow your direction. And you do those 4 things long before you actually take action, like physically dragging them out. So those are a couple simple things that United could have done that I think relate to this conversation.
Yeah, I guess the other day I was watching that video and I thought, what would Southwest do? How would someone else handle it? And go back to our question about branding, about protecting your brand. I will, I think that's important to see, really understand, and people should ask this question, how would they handle the situation even before it happens? I also want to bring up another point, is one of the things we've been seeing recently, especially with active shooter questions, and I don't want to get deep into the active shooter question, but when people sense that either a customer or employee is on the road to incivility, but they're not uncivil at that moment, Because we always see that. Oh yeah, we knew he was a pretty angry guy, and then he, shows him with a shotgun the next day. Like, how do you deal with people that, without gossiping, without prejudice, and without predicting things that will never happen? How do you deal with that? Where you look at, without the profiling question is a big one. Like, someone looks kind of creepy, walking around. Are you saying that just because they're different from you? Or are you saying that because there's some behavior? Any thoughts about how you not profile, but how do you identify those people that and do something about it without creating a scene yourself?
Yeah, I don't mind taking that one. I just don't want to. I don't want to jump too quickly.
I have something to say about that.
So you hit on some key points. Number one, it needs to be behavioral, right? If we're going to identify future behaviors, we need to be looking at past behaviors. And it's interesting. The man in Cleveland this week who uploaded his murder of a 74-year-old man on Facebook, he was described actually as a great guy. He is described as somebody who got along with folks and a long history of being a pretty decent person. But that's actually not a great predictor of future behavior. The best predictor of future behavior is recent behavior, right? And the closer you get to where you're at, the more likely that behavior predicts future behavior properly. But if you think about it this way, there are certain behavioral indicators that you can see, and we talk in themes. There are verbal indicators and there are nonverbal indicators. Many of these you know intuitively. Many of these you just kind of feel, sense, it creeps you out, it's intuition, etc. But you can actually study that. You can study, whether people's words are demeaning. They're constantly putting you down. They're usurping your authority. They're insulting in some way. You can readily identify whether people's words are disturbing because they're threatening. They're using profanity out of context, and you can definitely determine very easily whether somebody's words are directive, again, out of hierarchy. So when a customer demands something of somebody who's providing them service, that can be kind of normal, but that's a little bit out of hierarchy. Where that really is abnormal is when somebody demands that a police officer does something. Those type of directive statements start to indicate that somebody's stepping onto that pathway. And then we could go on and on about nonverbal behaviors, but there's a whole study on these pre-aggression, pre-disruptive behavior indicators that as you see them, the key is not just to look for them, but the key is to react. So you see something that makes you feel uncomfortable, probably the number one thing that you want to do is actually just change what you're doing. You see somebody beginning to escalate, something as simple as changing your speed of talk or changing your body position or asking somebody else into the conversation. Those things can actually interrupt people who are stepping onto the pathway towards uncivil behaviors.
So we're getting to the end here. I want to give Sandy and JP a chance to give one piece of advice, quick piece of advice to people who are confronted with someone who's got some level of anger. Any simple piece of advice, almost like what Jesse just gave. Either one of you want to give a thought, one last comment before we close up?
Well, I think going back to also to Jesse's comment about the violent behavior and the active shooter, I think a lot of it, and this is a whole separate conversation on threat assessment, but you have to determine whether it's, let's say, maybe domestic violence related, if it's former associate, if it's customer just coming in randomly, maybe it's an act of terrorism. So again, that's a whole separate expansion and conversation based on that topic. Parting comments, again, keep your finger on the pulse of your associates. Really have good conversations with them. Learn what their challenges are, both personally and professionally, and do a lot of listening. And if you commit to something, just make sure that you're following through on your commitments. I have folks that come up to me all the time throughout the day, and they come to me with information, and every once in a while there's information to say, hey, I think this associate may not be acting right. They seem out of sorts. Maybe there's not necessarily, maybe they're always grumpy, and all of a sudden their behavior changes to something completely off the wall that people wouldn't anticipate. It's not necessarily always aggressive behavior. But if you have an associate coming to you and saying that they have concerns with another associate, make sure you listen and make sure you do something to react. And if you don't know the answers, make sure you bubble that up to your corporate office. Because we need to find out different things. If it's a threat situation, do they own weapons at home? Again, is it a domestic situation? Is it a situation where they're a former associate and they may be disgruntled with the company? Or maybe there's threats that are directed directly towards other associates in the store or even just randomly customers. So you have to act in the moment. You have to keep calm at all times, but you have to do a lot of pre-training to ensure that things go smoothly when an incident occurs. And then follow up post-incident and see what you could have done better for next time.
Thank you very much. JP, your last comment quickly because we're running out of time.
Yeah, two things. Hurt people hurt people. And so we live in an age today where people are looking to be offended so that they can react to being offended. And so I always start a conversation with, how are you doing? And if they don't answer that question, I ask them again. And, so just remember, hurt people, and people are looking to be offended. Your initial conversation should be one of care and intent and love. And if you can start all your conversations that way, then hopefully, for the most part, everyone can be civil and everyone can win.
Thank you. That was great. Great final comment there. I do want to say one thing interesting, and I want to, because Jesse mentioned this to me a while back. I don't want to give you a chance to talk about it, but he said that you said to me a few weeks ago, in the past when people stole things from stores, they fled when they got caught. Now they confront, and I think it's an interesting issue. The times have changed, and we need to be ready for the behavior that people use, especially in the world of social media, which we talked about. So I want to thank the three of you. This has been a great session. Sandy, Jesse, JP, your insights were wonderful. For those on the call, you'll be seeing an email that will tell you what people talked about, some of the salient points. We'll send you a link to the video that you could share with your colleagues. And let me talk a little bit more about what we do here at BayPath in our Strategic Alliances Division. And I want to thank everybody for attending to hear a little bit of what we're all about. So what we do at BayPath University in our division is we offer workshops, short-term, long-term, customized workshops for organizations. And I saw a lot of managers and leaders here, negotiation, tools for first-time managers, communication skills, customer service, problem solving, being entrepreneurial, and issues that we talked about today. So stay aware. You'll be getting emails from us, hopefully not too much, and that will give you an insight as to what we can provide. And if you're interested, you should let Susan Manisoff know because she's our business development person. So that's an exciting time. We're going to be on May 3rd. We have some really an interesting group of people talking about empathy in healthcare. And I know about 20 to 30% of the attendees here are in healthcare, and that's going to be on May 3rd from 12 to 1. And you can participate in that. You'll be getting an e-blast about it probably tomorrow or next week. And that's going to be, we have a professor who teaches doctors about empathy. We have an oncologist talking about empathy as an oncologist, and someone who also works in a hospital in Cleveland. So it's going to be a great group. They're going to share with you their thoughts about positive empathy or using empathy to make you better at what you do. So that's an important one. And again, thank you for joining us. We do these regularly. We'll be adding more on. We've got a customer service one coming on in a couple of months or a month. We'll be sharing that with you. We'll get the schedule for the season out to people so they can put it on their schedules. We have a lot of repeat people, so that's great. We hope that you continue to be a repeat person because these are a lot of fun, and it gives us a chance to bring people to the table who are experts in the field and just have a conversation about the issues. Thank you very much. Have a nice day, and thanks to the panelists for spending the time with us. They take it out of their very busy time. Bye-bye.